Hi guys, SKETI here. Welcome back to a new tutorial. This time we're going to look at how to get you 5 ways how to get your mix cleaner overall. 5 different things that you can do to get those mix sounding as good as possible. So let's get to it. So first thing that we're going to look at is stem mixing. And what I do in all of my projects is basically I go through and separate all of the instrumentation into its own category. So for example here I've got a stem that's entirely dedicated to the drums. So you've got your kicks, your snares, drum fills, and then a group for hi-hats within that stem as well. So everything for the drums is just grouped into that one thing. And then I've got a group just for my sub basses, which is just a sine wave sub if you've seen my making your subs cleaner. I've got a stem just for my basses, so all that's in there is all of the basses that sit above the sub. Like I've got a group here within that where I made some Reeses together. I've then got a stem for my pads, which is anything like arpeggios or strings, piano chords, all that kind of thing. I've got one for my leads, so in this tune I've only got one lead line, so that's for that one there. I've then got one for my effects, so lots of different effects in this one. And finally I've also got a stem for my vocals as well. But as you noticed as I went through, each stem is set to a level. So my loudest, with this being a drum bass tune for example, is set to -10 decibels. This sub here is set to -10 as well, so those two sit together, but with the sub being sidechained against the drums, which I'll get to in a second. So the loudest stem really within my mix is -10 decibels. The bass is set to -11, the pads is set to -11, lead set to -11, effects set to -11, and vocals set to -12. Because for this mix I found that the vocals I wanted to be a little bit quieter. But yeah, like I said, the loudest stem is -10 decibels, and basically this means instead of every single channel going through to the master, I've basically got channels going through to the stems and then the stems going through the master. So really, technically in this I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 channels going to the master, and with the loudest one being at -10, which basically means when it gets to the master, it's not going to clip at all. I've already done some processing within the stems, and it just allows the master with some headroom to breathe a little bit more, so I can obviously add a mastering chain on the end of that as well if I want to. But it means that if I go into my drums here, like I've got a glue compressor just to make sure that nothing clips on that stem. But within that I can do all of my processing, and when I'm happy with it, it goes to the master out of the drum stem, into that glue compressor, and that stem will just catch anything that's a little bit too loud. So instead of it clipping the master, it gets caught there and then goes into the master. And the same if I look at the subs, again I've got my sidechain compressor and my glue compressor, same with my bass. And also this makes things simple as well, so like in my bass, I've got my bass stem, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I've got 10 different basses. Now obviously with sidechaining the drums against the bass like I have here, instead of having to put a sidechain compressor on every single different bass channel, I just put it on the stem, because obviously all those bass channels are running into the stem. So this really does simplify your mixing workflow as well. So the second thing we're going to look at is mixing up, not down. And what I mean by that is basically instead of going through and having to, like you're finding a channel's too loud and you're turning it down, then you turn the next one down, you'll basically be forever just riding those level faders until you get to a point where, and you just end up going in a loop where you're just constantly having to turn things down, where you've turned something down, then you found that something else is a little bit too loud, so then you have to turn that down, and then you have to turn that next thing down, and so on and so forth. So what I recommend, if you're just getting new to just starting with mixing principles, is start with everything at -infinity, and then start mixing it up until you feel like everything gets to a good level. And obviously with you doing that within the stems, you can then basically, as an overall stem thing, turn all of your stems down and then start turning them up individually. And in this case I've only got 7 stems, so you get to a point where you've mixed it up to a point that you like the level of everything working together. And the cool thing with that obviously as well is you're going to leave yourself with a lot of headroom, because if you're basically starting at 0 dB with everything and having to mix down and turn things down, you're basically trying to recover some headroom that you never had in the first place. Whereas if you're going up from -infinity, you've got infinite headroom, and then you're just basically decreasing that to a point where you feel like you're happy, and then you can go to your master channel and stick some mastering plugins on it as well. So the third thing we're going to look at is stereo image. And I'm basically just going to show you with this stereo imaging tool. Now there's one, a free one by Ozone. This one I use is by Flux. It's called Stereo Tool version 3. And this is basically to just look at the phase correlation and the stereo image overall. So if I just play this tune back, what that is showing me there is the overall stereo image. Now you see that's getting big there because they had a little bit of a reverb and delay coming in. But basically this is allowing me to see if there's anything spiking out massively wide or if it's completely mono. And as you can see, as it was playing back, everything seemed to be pretty much in the same stereo field. Or width of the stereo field. There was nothing that was just jumping up massively and jumping massively to the left and the right, which is not a problem to have a super wide stereo mix, but again, if you mix it down to mono, you could end up with phase cancellation. But this just allows me to see how wide my stereo image is, and if I do find that anything is spiking massively wide, then I can basically go through, find that culprit, and then using some mid-side processing, which I didn't really need to do on this, but obviously with an EQ, which I do have a tutorial about mid-side EQ processing, is I can just basically get the side and then limit how wide that specific signal is. So yeah, that's a really good thing to obviously make your mixes better, is just have a stereo imager on the master channel just to find out if there's anything spiking out. And again, you can go through and solo each stem until you find the culprit that's causing the stereo width spike, and then you can go through and limit that with some mid-side processing. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to look at is making sure that everything is in its right place within the mix. And what I mean by that is, there's a couple of things. Obviously there's the EQ element, the frequency content, and then obviously the panning, the stereo width, stereo image component as well. So for the EQ component, like I showed previously in my making cleaner subs and basses tutorial, is making sure that your sub has its own space and that the bass has its own space. So for example, as you can see, I've got a high pass filter on all of these basses here, so that when the sub comes in, it means that that sine wave bottom end sub is literally just going to sit in its own place and the basses aren't going to conflict with it. If I go to my drums, for example, with the kick, you can see that I've notched in the 500 Hz region, because that's where a lot of your fundamental frequencies for your musical components sit. So basically I'm just going through and making sure, like you can see with the snare there, I've done a notch, but then I've also driven the fundamental of that snare a little bit as well, brought down some of the top end so the hi-hats sit nicely above it, and basically just going through and finding the right, everything having its own place in the mix, so things aren't fighting for the same EQ, same frequency range. And then again with the stereo image, making sure that all of my bottom end is in mono. So if I go through here, for example, and just turn this EQ on, like you can see I've done some mid-side processing, so literally all of the bottom end of that is in mono, and then everything above it starts to get obviously wider in the stereo image. So yeah, it's basically just going through and making sure that your kick isn't clashing with your snare drum, that they've all got their own space, or your snare drum's not clashing with your lead line because of frequencies. Just going through, making sure that everything's in its right place. And finally, to finish off, is sidechaining. Now I have done a full tutorial on this, so I won't go into this in massive detail, but you can obviously look at that tutorial about sidechaining. But this is just to make sure that the drums punch through in your mix and that it leaves space, so when your basses are playing, that they duck down so your drums come through, so you don't have everything clashing together. And also I sometimes take that a step further with, so I haven't done it on this mix because it wasn't necessary, but sometimes with lead lines, if it's a really strong lead line, I might actually put a sidechain compressor on there. So obviously if it's playing all the time when the drums are hitting, so when the drums come in, it just ducks slightly, not so it completely disappears out of the mix when the drums come in, because you don't want that sort of audible pumping effect, because that sounds quite weird. But it just ducks it slightly, because we can confuse our brains quite easily, where our brains think the sound is still there but it's not as loud. Just like I say, keep that sidechain quite transparent. So for example, I tend to use a ratio of 5:1, and depending on how strong the signal is that's going into the compressor, it's not ducking down massively. So obviously if I played this by itself, if I just play this bass channel by itself, you're going to hear the sidechain compressor. Obviously as I turned it off and on there, you could hear the difference. But then when I obviously stick all of the other musical elements together with it, you're not really going to hear that sidechain compressor happening at all, but it means that the drums and the basses are very clean with each other and they're all coming through at the right level I want it to. So there we go guys, that's 5 ways to make your mixes cleaner and sound better overall. Anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and you found it useful. If you have, please drop a comment, leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you see these videos more in the future. Share it around with your friends as well. Also, I'm on Twitch streaming most nights of the week, so if you'd like to come and listen to other people's tunes, get feedback on your own work as well, it's a great little community. Everyone's really respectful of each other and really nice as well. But anyway guys, I shall see you next time. Bye.
Everybody jump up, come on! Come on! Everybody jump up!